if you pay attention to the sermon titles in the bulletin, and Sandy, you know that's not always a smart practice. Because, you see, the bulletin needs to get printed and prepared early in the week, but who knows what I'll be thinking about by the end of the week. So you can see the title of this sermon is Apocalypse Eve. And that's not what I'm going to preach on. But I will tell you what that sermon was going to be. And it's about Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday was a kind of Apocalypse Eve. The last night on the town before the soldiers shipped out. That's a Palm Sunday. The last good day you had with someone you loved who died. That's a Palm Sunday. The decision to dance despite the diagnosis. That's a Palm Sunday move. Because what's coming up is denial, betrayal, scourging, death. But for one day, celebration. Now, where I was going to go with that sermon is to say, guess what? That's actually our reality every day. Because we never know what tomorrow holds. So how could we live with Palm Sunday spirit? Anyway, that's not today's sermon. So the title of today's sermon is Jesus and the Crowds. Anthony, you remember? Yeah. So, it's very interesting to read Matthew. Matthew always talks about the crowds. That's a theme in the Gospel of Matthew. It says here, when they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethpage at the Mount of Olives. That's a significant detail. In Jewish thought, the Mount of Olives is the place where the Messiah will touch down when the Messiah returns to earth. Even now, if you are an Orthodox Jew, you are trying to be buried in the cemetery on the Mount of Olives to this day, because then you will be first to greet the Messiah when he comes. It is the most expensive real estate in the world, is the cemetery on the Mount of Olives. And so when it says here that Jesus shows up at the Mount of Olives, this is like the curtains opening on the Messiah. Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go to the village. You'll find a donkey. I don't want to go into the stuff. Matthew's got too many equines, but that's okay. They got the donkey. They put the cloaks on it. A large crowd spread their cloaks. A large crowd spread their cloaks on the road. Others cut branches from the trees, spread them on the road. Then it says, verse 9, the crowds went ahead, and those that followed were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heavens. And then it says, when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil. We're going to come back to that. The word for turmoil is seizo. You ever heard of a seismic event? This is the word for an earthquake. Seismos. So it says that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the place trembled. And then the crowds said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. The crowds. So I decided to go back through the Gospel of Matthew and notice the crowds. The crowds first appear in the Gospel of Matthew coming out to the Jordan to be baptized by John. And then it said, as Jesus began his preaching ministry in the Galilee, which is way up north, 100 miles north of Jerusalem, great crowds followed him. The crowds gathered and Jesus taught them the Beatitudes. Hello, Yolanda, and congratulations on your walk and winning all the raffles. You're welcome. And good morning, Tommy. I'm glad you woke up. Anyway, here are the crowds. Jesus taught them the Beatitudes. Jesus blessed them. Jesus affirmed them as the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And he called them to a higher righteousness, not just to love the neighbor, but to love the enemy. Jesus taught the crowds the disciples' prayer, Our Father. And as it says in Matthew 7:28, when the Sermon on the Mount was over, the crowds were astounded. Now let's just take a minute and think about who's in the crowd. It's interesting because people who were satisfied weren't in the crowd. They stayed home. If you ask them how they're doing, they say, it's all good. I don't feel like getting up. Who would go out and stand for hours to listen to someone speak? Who would follow someone around for days, for weeks, for months? It's people who were desperate. People who were hungering and thirsting for something. The crowds. The crowds kept following Jesus. They watched him heal a leper. They watched him heal the centurion's daughter and Peter's mother-in-law who was in bed with a fever. These are all places in Matthew where it talks about the crowds, as if the crowd is its own character. Then, in Matthew 8, you see the Sermon on the Mount's in Matthew 6. It says the crowd got a little too much for Jesus, and he got on a boat and went across the Sea of Galilee. And there was a storm, and the disciples were worried, and Jesus calmed the waves. But Jesus came back. As soon as he got back to the shore, it says when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Can you imagine this throng of people constantly following Jesus? And then the interesting relationship Jesus has with them, where he has compassion on them. They're so needy. We'll see. He's going to feed them. He's going to heal them. He's going to teach them. But sometimes it's still a little much, and he has to just get in a boat and get away. On the Sabbath, Jesus cured a man with a withered hand, and many more joined the crowds. And there were more healings, but that's in Matthew 10. And Jesus says to the crowd, don't make a big deal out of this healing on the Sabbath. I don't want everything known yet. And then Jesus' mother and brothers showed up. And someone said to Jesus, Jesus, your family's here. And then Jesus looked at the crowd and said, what? Here's my family. It's so interesting, this relationship Jesus had with this crowd of people. Then the crowds gathered on the Sea of Galilee. On the beach, Jesus told them parables. And then it says Jesus withdrew again, kind of coming to be with them, but then having to be by himself. It says that in Matthew 14, Jesus went to a deserted place, but the crowds kept following him. They still found him when he tried to hide. And when he returned, there they are, camped out, hungry. And he then does the miracle of feeding them with the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And then it says he withdrew again. That's the time he walked on the water. The crowds are following Jesus everywhere, and there's this moment then where he just takes his disciples and goes away to Caesarea Philippi, just for a retreat with them. And then he goes with Peter and James and John to the top of a mountain, and there he's transfigured. I'm going through the whole story of the Gospels. And then it says something happened. Jesus crossed from Galilee, from the north, to Judea, the south, getting close to Jerusalem, and it says the crowds kept following him. And finally, in Matthew 20, Jesus is on the last leg of his journey to Jerusalem. He's walking from Jericho to Jerusalem, and 2 blind men cry out, "Lord, have mercy on us, heal us." And the crowd tells them to be quiet. And Jesus ignores the crowd and heals these 2 blind men. But it's so interesting. This is a moment where these people who've been following Jesus all this time, and they've been faithful, and they've been hanging on his every word, but they think they control him. Even if you follow Jesus, you don't get to control Jesus. You don't get to say who deserves mercy and who doesn't. And so finally, here we are now approaching Jerusalem. It's the people's army. It's the march on a capital city, and no more withdrawing. No more silencing. Why, now Jesus isn't going to try to tell them to keep it a secret. In fact, if they don't cry out, the rocks and stones will. This is the crowd of the poor, and this is their time to let it rip. Hosanna, Hosanna. Imagine. This is Bonnaroo. This is their Woodstock. This is a spontaneous poor people's festival. This is Cinco de Mayo in the barrio. This is Juneteenth in the hood. It's Sadie Hawkins Day in the holler. Do you all know where those places are? And here comes the king and his entourage. And this is improv. This is potluck. We don't have a budget for this. We don't have a Chamber of Commerce committee planning this for months. We don't have an Olympic planning committee. Mitt Romney's not in charge. This is not Fenway opening day. We're not going to have a flyover. This is poor people finally having their day. Hosanna, Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This train was bound for glory. These saints, the poor, the meek, the humble, they're marching in. It is the 1963 March on Washington. There were 2 processions that day in Judea. From Jericho. I don't know if you can see it on a map, but Jericho is on the east. Jericho is next to the Jordan River. So from the east, Jesus and his group are having their procession. Their king on a donkey. Their standards and flags, branches. Their royal road, cloaks. From the west, from the Mediterranean, there was another parade that day. It was Pontius Pilate coming to Jerusalem with an army to make sure there was order during Passover week. Pontius Pilate rode on a white war horse. Pontius Pilate had this huge entourage of soldiers, imperial soldiers, with all their, you've seen all those gladiator kind of movies, right? Can you imagine? They didn't wave palm branches. They waved huge embroidered flags. Can you see these two parades the same day? Which king do you follow? Now, let's go to the next detail. This detail is the one where it says, when Jesus entered, the whole city was in turmoil. And again, that's the Greek word seismos, like seismograph, seismic, earthquake. It's the same word we're going to see next week, because it's going to say Easter morning there was a seismos, and the stone rolled away. It's the same word here. At the beginning of Holy Week, there is an earthquake, but it's inside people. You see, which procession shook the world more? Which procession was a bigger threat? The C.S. Lewis set of books about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they're about a figure like God whose name is Aslan. And Aslan is a lion. And one day some children ask Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, Theo, you hearing this? Raise your hand if you hear this. All right. One day the children asked Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, is Aslan safe? And Aslan is the God figure. And they go, no, but he's good. Is Aslan safe? No, but he's good. Is Jesus safe? Jesus is an earthquake. If you don't feel shook, it's not Jesus. If your faith is just a comforter, if your faith is not also telling you to keep growing, to keep moving, to keep expanding, not to settle, it's not Jesus. Because when Jesus shows up, it causes me to tremble. Tremble, tremble. And the crowd says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Wow, it was a great day for the crowd. And God blessed the crowd. And I think part of our lesson today is we do, as followers of Jesus, always want to be part of that crowd of the poor, the humble, the desperate. We have a special allegiance and affiliation with them. Who are Jesus's people? They're the ones who are hungry, who are thirsting, who are, what did it say? Harassed and helpless. But we have to always remember those same people who shouted Hosanna just like you did this morning on Sunday. What did they say on Friday? Cindy, you had it in your prayer. So I just want to leave us with this week. Dear Lord, let us not just be believers on Palm Sunday. Let us be believers too on Good Friday.